Okay, so we've looked at America's involvement in World War I and how it was critical to the Allied success. Today we're going to be looking at the end of World War I and how the things that happened at the end of World War I actually, even though this is called the Great War, and we hope this would be the war to end all wars, it actually set in place the stage for World War II. Okay? And this goes with a graphic organizer that's titled The End of World War I, and it'll have how the war led to World War II at the bottom, the Allies' agenda, all that kind of stuff for some of the boxes on the graphic organizer. Okay, so here we have a discussion of Woodrow Wilson, and Woodrow Wilson was our president throughout World War I, and he was truly a visionary, a person who was looking more to the future than to the past. And it was his idea that this really should be the war to end all wars. He was an intellectual and an optimist, and really thought that the thing to do now that the war was over was not to try and settle the grudge match from the past, but instead lay the foundations for a more prosperous and hopeful future. And so before he left to go to Europe, he'll be the first president to ever visit Europe as a sitting president, he's going to come up with his 14 points plan, which is his 14 ideas for how we can ensure that another war like this never happens again. We can learn from our history and not be doomed to repeat it. His 14 points, you don't have to know all of them. These are the key ideas. He says, first of all, that we should have freedom of the seas, that there should be no tariffs and there should be free trade, and that countries should never attack another's country that they're not at war with. So all that attacking on U.S. shipping, for example, that happened before the war should never happen because neutral ships at sea should be left alone. Part of that also goes with this no tariffs idea. I kind of jumped the gun with that, but the idea is that we should have free trade as well. So there should be no tariffs, and that countries will trade freely with each other and not have to worry about their shipping being attacked if they're neutral. And also that this will force countries to trade more with each other and become more economically interdependent. And countries that rely on each other for trade are less likely to fight each other. So he thought free trade was the way to make us so interdependent that we would never think of attacking one another. Also, there's this very important idea called self-determination. The idea of self-determination is that people within a country or a nation have a right to decide for themselves what type of government they shall have. And ideally, Wilson would like to see this through a popular election because, of course, he believes in what he calls his missionary policy, which is the idea that we should make the world safe for democracy. So, funnily enough, though, this is limited to Europe. A lot of colonial countries in our empire and that have been imperialized and are colonies, they get very hopeful. Take, for example, Vietnam. They get very hopeful that this means that they, too, will have a right to self-determination. But it's quite clear that Wilson does not consider that something for colonial subjects, only for European, kind of first world white people, I guess. He also believes that we should reduce our weapons, that this arms race that took place before the war was eventually what sowed the seeds of our destruction, and so that we needed to have arms reduction talks and limit the sizes of our navies and our munitions. He also thought that we should have a world organization, and he called it the League of Nations, and that at the League of Nations, all countries could meet and bring their concerns to the League of Nations and solve their problems peacefully, as opposed to fighting things out. He also said there should be no secret treaties, that all agreements should be arrived at openly between nations. And if you recall, that's some of the secret treaties that were rumored before World War I led to kind of greater intrigue between the European powers. And then the rest of the 14 points you don't need to know specifically. Those are ones that moved borders or created new nations or tried to adjust the map of Europe to make it less likely that different ethnic groups would fight for their freedom in the future or assassinate people as they had done in the Serbians attacking the Archduke Ferdinand. So you can see here's President Wilson, and he is with... it was taken at Buckingham Palace, and he's with his wife and King George and Queen Mary and Princess Mary as he went to tour Great Britain, and he toured France, and he was received as a huge hero as the Americans were seen as kind of a key nation in bringing an end to the war. Unfortunately for Wilson, while he's received with such enthusiasm, they are more enthusiastically receiving him than his ideas, because the Allies really do not intend on listening to a word he says. So, I'm reprising the fortune-telling ball back, because here's Wilson. He's pretending like he's trying to look towards the future. He's trying to foretell the future and make sure it's more peaceful. Whereas the Allied powers are all about the past. They basically say, Wilson, take your crystal ball and quit trying to affect the future. Instead, we want to talk about the past and what Germany has done to us in the past, and we want to get retribution for what has happened in the past. So this is Wilson. He's all about the future. Europe is all about the past, and they don't really take too kindly to the 14 points because the 14 points really aren't about getting revenge for what has happened in the past. So their agenda includes much more kind of a grudge match. One, they want to get money from Germany because they have spent a lot of money on the war effort and they need money to repay their debts. So Austria-Hungary is basically dissolved. There is no Austria-Hungary to hit up for the money, so they think Germany will pay very nicely. Thank you. And they also want to take all the colonies from Germany that they've been having their eye on. For example, a lot of the colonies from the Middle East are going to be key, and we'll talk about that in the final treaty. They also want Germany to be demilitarized. They want to be sure that in the future they don't have to worry about a militaristic Germany attacking them ever again, and so they want to limit the size of their army and navy. Well, not even limit it, but really just get rid of it so that Germany has no military at all. And basically they just want to punish Germany for what happened in the war. So you can see there's nothing in common between Wilson's 14 points and the Allies' agenda. So, as you can imagine, the treaty is going to be difficult to pound out. It's called the Treaty of Versailles because they agreed at the Palace of Versailles in France is where the treaty was signed. But there's not much there that's going to make the 14 points, that's going to reflect the 14 points ideas. First of all, they decide they're going to make Germany pay reparations to France and Britain in the billions of dollars, and that's going to be an interesting idea. Because Germany doesn't really have the money, and they're going to start printing the money and just making worthless paper money that's not actually backed by gold to pay their debts. And that's going to lead to massive inflation in Germany that will require the famous picture, for example, of Germans taking a whole wheelbarrow full of money to the store to buy bread. So that's going to basically wreak havoc with the German economy. In fact, these reparations that were to be paid to Germany, to be paid from Germany to Britain and France, just recently got paid off. France and Britain had sold the debt over and over again to private debt collectors because they thought that nothing would ever come of it. And it just, in the last year or two, was actually finally in 2010, the German reparations debt was finally paid to whatever private investors had actually bought up that debt. Also, the Germans had to declare that the war was their fault, which they thought was kind of confusing since Austria-Hungary had initially been the ones that had squared off against Russia, though it was the Germans that did fire the first shots and start the actual shooting, but it was Austria-Hungary squaring off against Russia that had actually caused the declaration of war. Also, Germany is going to be forced to give up their colonies to France and Britain, and these colonies are important. They're things like Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon. It's fascinating to realize that the modern Middle Eastern crisis that was begun when Britain turned Palestine into Israel could have never happened had Britain not gotten Palestine through this war. So World War I is really setting us up for understanding modern kind of geopolitics, I guess. And then 9 new nations are going to be created and a League of Nations. So there's only one of the 14 points contained in the Treaty of Versailles, and that's the League of Nations. Wilson thought, well, as long as we have a League of Nations, perhaps we can all agree as an international community to the other parts of my 14 points. And so if he could only have one of his 14 points in there, he guessed a League of Nations was probably the most important one. You can see here that this is a cartoon, and we'll talk more about it, of the Allied powers forcing Germany to accept these terms. So this is a really important map to help you understand. It's going to be on your test, so to help you understand why Russia and Germany are particularly outraged about what has happened after World War I concerning the map. So you can see here's Europe before World War I with Austria-Hungary here. And this is Russia, and this is Germany. You can see what it looks like after World War I. Germany is here. Poland has been created partly out of Germany's land and partly out of Russia's land. But what's also bizarre is right here is Germany too, this little piece of land here. And remember, there's ethnicity involved here, okay? There's people who are Germans that are now stuck in Poland. And that was needed because they thought that Poland needed a corridor to get to the sea. It's called the Polish Corridor. So they divided ethnic Germans by letting Poland come up in between this area so that Poland would have a port and therefore have some viable trade. So you can see there's all kinds of issues here related to the map and how the creation of Poland is going to be one that really outrages both the Germans and the Russians. The Russians weren't even invited because they dropped out of the war due to the Bolshevik Revolution. They decided to, they weren't even invited to the meeting. And so you can imagine how Russia is rather outraged that their land was taken even though they weren't present at the table when this map was drawn out. You can also see how Austria-Hungary has dissolved, and this here is Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary. This whole area here has been divided into separate countries for each ethnic group. Okay? So, the reaction in the United States is a surprise to Wilson. The Senate really doesn't like the whole idea of the League of Nations. The one part of Wilson's 14 points that's in the treaty they don't like. Also, they were a little miffed that they have to pass the treaty. Excuse me, they have to ratify the treaty, and Wilson really didn't even invite them to go be greeted as heroes in Europe. And also, when they came back and were going to bring the treaty into the Senate floor, Wilson wouldn't even allow senators to carry the treaty in. So some petty kind of scorekeeping was going on here too. But the Senate really didn't understand how the League of Nations was going to function, and they were afraid that it would in some way preempt some of the Senate's power. So a senator named Henry Cabot Lodge, he led the opposition to the treaty. His reservations became known as the Lodge Reservations. Wilson realizes that the support for the treaty is not great, so he goes on this countrywide tour trying to sell the treaty directly to the American people, and by hoping to appeal directly to the people, they will pressure the senators to pass the treaty. While he's on this speaking tour, his doctors warn him to take it easy, but he does not listen to their admonitions. And what actually happens is he has a stroke, and it's a very debilitating stroke. He is unable to walk or talk or in any significant way lead the nation. It's quite ironic. His first wife had died while he was president, and he had quickly remarried a childhood sweetheart of his. And Edith Wilson basically becomes the president of the United States because the President Wilson is so incapacitated. But we have no process for this in the Constitution. The Constitution only says what happens if the president dies. It doesn't say at this time what we do if the president is just incapacitated but not dead. So basically, Edith Wilson protects the president and serves as kind of the quiet president behind closed doors. She receives counsel and goes and talks to the president about what he thinks, and he makes decisions, and she reports what those decisions are. But to some degree, we've had a female president in Edith Wilson, but most Americans are totally unaware of this, and she was by no means sworn in, but was rather forced into this position due to circumstances. So as a result, Wilson's unable to defend the treaty, and so the Senate never signs the treaty or approves it. We never ratify the treaty. A League of Nations is formed, but we are not members of it, ironically, and it will be rather strange that the one of the 14 points that Wilson wanted most is the one that leads to the greatest opposition to it in the United States, and we never do ratify it. So there's going to be real problems in the treaty that actually lead to World War II. One is that the Germans are going to be humiliated and they're going to suffer huge economic distress due to these reparations. And so when a strong leader like Adolf Hitler comes about and begins creating jobs and says he has answers to these problems, they are willing to give him great power, and he assumes it willingly. Also, Russia is really mad because they lost land and they want to regain that land that they lost in Poland. So, before World War II begins, Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, is actually going to approach Hitler and say, hey, we're never going to be friends, because Hitler hated communism, and Stalin hated Hitler. We're never going to be friends, but why don't we go ahead and agree to divide Poland back up? So Hitler is going to invade Poland, and that's going to start World War II, because he wanted to reunite the Germans that were trapped in Poland. And so you can see that World War I, ironically, really does lead right into the dominoes to fall to begin World War II. Okay? So I hope that has well prepared you for your upcoming assessment on World War I, and thanks for looking at this video. Bye!